Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Today, I'm super excited to be chatting with Fritz Horstman about his brand new book, Interacting with Color, a practical guide to Josef Albers' color experiments. Fritz, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Fritz is a curator and educator and artist based in Connecticut, where he is the education director at the Josef and Anni Albers Foundation. And since 2014, he has given workshops and lectures across the globe about Josef and Anni Albers teaching practice and artwork. And he has also curated exhibitions nationally and internationally. And his sculptures and installations and prints have also been shown across Europe and across the US. So yeah, we're super excited to be chatting with you, Fritz. His publication, Interacting with Color, is a hands-on teaching tool that's designed to enable readers of all ages to engage with color through the kind of creative exploration that characterized Josef Albers' own classroom. So yeah, that's my little introduction.
Super. Thank you so much.
It would be great if you could just start off by telling us a little bit more about the book project, Fritz.
Sure. So as education director at the Albers Foundation, I spent a lot of time thinking about these two artists, Josef and Anni Albers, and how their artwork and pedagogy can be used today and why it's still relevant. And most frequently, Josef Albers's color exercises are the topic that I'm focused on. And famously, in 1963, he published Interaction of Color. That first edition was the silkscreen's real masterpiece of printing. 2000 were in that first edition, and by 1971, it was in a paperback edition, and it has been in print ever since. It is this wildly popular book that is beautiful and canonical, but it is in some ways a bit opaque and mysterious. And frequently, roughly once a month at least, someone, an artist or a teacher, or just someone who's curious, will approach me, will email me or call and say, is there some tool that will help me understand interaction of color? Because it's very difficult. And I agree, it is difficult material. It's at once very simple and wildly abstract at the same time. And so that was, those conversations led me to start to think about, well, how can I make the workshops that I run accessible to a wider audience? Is there some sort of publication? Yale Press, who published Interaction of Color, approached me a few years ago asking if there was something like this in the works. And in fact, there was. And so that led to me making a proper proposal and then, of course, accepting it. And just earlier this month, the actual book itself emerging into the world. There we have it. Yeah. And so Interacting with Color, a practical guide to Josef Albers' color experiments, is in every way referencing or is a companion to Interaction of Color. And what I did was I chose what I consider to be sort of the 8 most important exercises from Interaction of Color and gave them more illustration, more step-by-step how we might do this, more anecdotes from Albers' classroom and from my own experience of teaching material over and over. And with the hopes that someone who's reading this will have an experience similar to being in an actual workshop that I might run or that someone else might run.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that little introduction. And yes, I have, of course, read the book, and I would say it is totally a must-have for anyone who's looking to kind of implement these exercises or just kind of explore the work further. And you've led workshops here at the museum, Fritz, and we actually have some leftover different like colored paper strips that we use for workshops even today. And it's just so super helpful to be able to reference this.
Yeah.
To explore the ideas in the book and really demonstrate the presence of these hands-on activities within Albers' classroom, what we wanted to do today is explore a number of works by students of Josef Albers at Black Mountain College for our viewers. So for those of you who are learning about Black Mountain College history, of course, Josef Albers taught at Black Mountain College from 1933 to 1949. And the importance of Josef Albers to Black Mountain College history cannot be overstated. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. We wanted to take some visuals and just start off by exploring a number of, or however many you want, Fritz, some of the basic concepts within the book and just demonstrating those for the audience. And then we're going to talk about some works of art.
Yeah, excellent. Well, so interaction of color opens with an experiment and demonstration of an idea called color relativity. It goes under a few different names, but color relativity kind of sums it up. It is to say that one color can change its appearance in relation to two different colors. So I have these 3 pieces of color aid paper, which was the material that was most frequently used in Albers's classes towards the end of his teaching career. And it's the material that I most frequently use. Of course, you could use lots of other materials. As long as there's color, you can demonstrate these things. And I'm hoping that I can make the illusion of this brown changing color possible. Just arranging it like this with the brown paper on top of the green and the purple, there's really not much going on in terms of color relativity. But if I take a white strip of paper and lay it down the middle, it starts to appear that on one side over here, the brown is looking darker, and on this side, it's looking lighter. So that is a very simple demonstration of color relativity, right? This was happening at the beginning of Albers's classes. The earliest example that we found is in the Western Regional Archives, and it is a work from 1936 by a student named Nan Weston, who was in Josef Albers's color class that year. And I'm just going to share that on the screen so we can all enjoy it. So this example from Nan Weston from 1936 you can see it's just in a notebook, this binder that must have been her class notes from that particular semester. And she's used, so color aid didn't exist at that point. And so she's used, looks like construction paper and maybe wallpaper or maybe gift wrap. In any case, this large pink area in the background and this large blue area in the background are then juxtaposed with a sort of a lavenderish, like a light pink rosy color laid on top of both of them. And on top of the blue, that color that's been set on top looks far rosier, looks more red, looks pinker. And that same color set on top of the pink, let's call it wallpaper, is much more purple or much bluer. So this is, again, demonstrating that idea of color relativity. And it is the first example that we know of from Albers's class where this idea was used. So Albers, of course, had been teaching at the Bauhaus in Germany beginning in 1923, but in the Bauhaus, he was not specifically teaching color. It wasn't until he came to Black Mountain College that he started to teach color. This was one of those very early moments in the color course, and already color relativity is very obviously central to his teaching. It stays there for the rest of his color teaching career until he retires from teaching in 1958. And it is central to his book, Interaction of Color, and it's also very central to my book, Interacting with Color. It is from that point that we build out. Frequently, students will ask me, well, what am I going to do with this knowledge, this idea of color relativity? I say, well, it's not like you're going to take this and go like change the way you dress in the morning. It might affect the way you choose colors in a painting, perhaps. Maybe you're going to make a painting that really demonstrates color relativity, but that would be a very specific idea to represent in a painting or in anything. What it does provide is a way to articulate color, to think about color, and to start to understand this idea of color intervals. And that's something that we get to very quickly, the space between two different colors. How that color that's sitting on top, in Weston's example here, how that color that's sitting on top of the two different colors, what is the interval between it and the blue, and what the interval between it and the pink? And being able to control those intervals starts to show some really interesting ideas. And so I'm going to show a couple of more examples here. Here's one from Roberta Blair from her color class that she took with Albers in 1944. And this is in the collection of the Black Mountain College Museum and Art Center. And here she is demonstrating the illusion of transparence. You can probably see just from the texture in the photo that these are pieces of construction paper that have been cut out very meticulously so that the edges seem to connect in such a way. And it gives this illusion that there is, in the upper left, a rectangle of lighter gray, maybe a tissue that's been laid over the top of some objects below it. And then maybe at the bottom, we see that darker rectangle. So it appears that a dark black rectangle, perhaps again of tissue or a colored gel or something, or maybe there's a shadow that's been cast over it. We get this illusion, and it starts to create space and this feeling of how different planes can intersect. And all of that is done because Blair is able to control the intervals between her colors. And I go much more deeply into this in the book, of course. But I'm going to stop sharing for a second here to show you in ColorAid how that works. So Albers is very specific in his book, and I am clear also in mine, that we are doing this with colored paper and not paint. Of course, I'm sitting in front of a color study that Albers himself did with paint. But in his classroom, in the color classroom, he was only using colored paper. And for a couple of reasons. One, in colored paper, you don't have to mix paint, and mixing paint is a specific skill. And he wanted everyone to be able to sort of just hit the ground running and get straight into the ideas and not be frustrated by learning how to use a paintbrush if you've never done it before, or mixing paints. And two, if you are mixing paint, it can be difficult to recreate a particular mixture. So in colored paper, having at least 25 or 100, or in some cases, many hundreds of colors in front of you, you can really just run straight into the material. Okay, so with colored paper, making that illusion of transparency becomes a skill of spotting the intervals between different colors. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So I've got 3 different purples here. If I arrange them like so, okay, so that the dark one is in the back, and then the middle purple is in the middle, and then the lightest purple is here on the bottom. I think of this as sort of like a sleeping bag composition. There's a pillow sleeping bag. And it creates this illusion that this whole object is a rectangle that is somehow being laid on top of or possibly underneath this rectangle. And that is possible because this line is continuous and this line is continuous. If I move it like so, the illusion is no longer there. To go back to Blair's example, she's doing a much more complicated composition than this one that I have just put together, but using the same principles. And talking about those intervals, if Blair had used, instead of 3 different grays to create that illusion in the upper left corner, and one of the grays was far too dark, for example, the illusion would be broken. We wouldn't be able to see that nearly as easily. So I realize I'm sort of running through this really quickly, and it does really benefit from getting hands-on with the material. But, I think it is a really useful and interesting idea.
Totally. And I think it's also interesting and cool to point out another function of the paper is that it's an opaque material. So, this exercise is teaching how to create the illusion of transparency without actually using a transparent object, which is just another aspect of it, and something that it's great to be able to do as a student of painting or any other medium, other than glass, that something that's going to use transparency. And
Right.
I would love to hear you talk about that a little bit, actually, because Albers actually worked in glass. So that's
That's
always been
true.
fascinating to me.
Yeah. So we're reeling back the years for a moment here. Albers arrived at the Bauhaus in 1920. He was 32 years old at the time and had already had a little bit of work with colored glass. He had made a stained glass window for his home church in Bottrop, Germany. He was a devout Catholic his whole life, and so this window was an important thing that he made. He arrives at the Bauhaus and very quickly is interested in the glass studio there, and starts going to the town dump and breaking up bottles and finding ways to stick those together into a composition, these things that he called glass windows, these things that he called glass paintings. And those paintings are assemblages. They're essentially stained glass windows, but what they are a way for him to experiment with color and material simultaneously, wherein color is material. And I think that remains true for him for the rest of his life, really, that yes, he's making a painting, and in the case of the painting behind me, that is paint that's been applied onto a paper surface, but he's not thinking of the paint as material. He's thinking of the color as the material that's really at play there. How can that color be pushed and pulled and rearranged in ways that make it come to life?
Totally.
And so, as you point out, in glass, for example, an illusion, it's not an illusion of transparency, it's just transparency. That may well have fed into his interest in having students then depict illusions of transparency. As I'd said, students will ask, what am I going to do with color relativity in my art practice? And there's not a straightforward answer there. It's sort of like you're learning the grammar of color here, just as a poet's not going to start writing poetry until they understand the grammar of the language, similar with color. However, in the illusion of transparency, you certainly could use that in all sorts of instances in a painting or in a drawing or another form of abstract thinking.
Totally.
Yeah.
Do we want to pull up another color experiment by Roberta Blair that I think is also a really great example of transparency?
Let's do. So this is another one of Roberta Blair's color studies from her 1944 class with Albers. And here it's a far more complicated composition. We see these 5 bands of color on the left and 5 bands of color on the right, and laid over the top of them are 2 ovals of colors that are variations of the colors that seem to underlie them. And we know that this is colored paper, it's not mixed paint. And so how does one create this illusion? And it is the illusion of light being cast onto color. It looks as if 2 spotlights are hitting some sort of a surface. So how does one find the colors to create that illusion? And to make that a consistent shape all the way around the oval. And that the answer to that is to be able to control the intervals. This is admittedly quite a bit more difficult than the first example that we showed from Blair, because she has to balance 5 different colors on the left and, well, actually 6 colors on the right. I misspoke earlier. So the way that this is done is by controlling the intervals, and the interval between this lighter brown and this darker brown is the same as the interval between this, well, it's barely even a blue anymore, and this darker blue, which is the same as the interval between this red and this sort of maroony color, and the same between this and this and this and this. And by all of those intervals being equal or roughly equal, I would bet that there's been a little bit of fading in the intervening 80 years, since it's a construction paper, which is not known for its light fastness. Nevertheless, the illusion persists. By all of these intervals being roughly equal, the illusion that light has been cast over them is believable. And similarly over here, these intervals are all the same. This is certainly one of the exercises that I really focus on in my book, because it is so sort of eye-popping when it works, and it's totally achievable. It's just sort of, you just need to get into it and start to play with those intervals. If the intervals are wrong, you'll know it right away, but when they are together, they really sing.
Exactly. Yeah. And I love that it can just be created with something as simple to work with as colored paper.
Yeah. Or it could be done with something like yarn. So another student of Albers's, Elizabeth Jenner-John, studied with him in his last year at Black Mountain College in 1949, and created this wonderful weaving that year, in which we do see some of the illusion of transparency taking place, but done in a very different material. So she, of course, is controlling the materials and techniques of weaving, which are a very advanced skill set, but she's doing that in such a way that there are areas where it appears that some of the rectangles are overlapping one another.
Yeah, and it's really complex to imagine kind of putting this piece together and drafting it out and then executing it on a loom, because weaving requires such a degree of structural thinking,
Right.
even a lot more kind of planning than just kind of putting together colored paper. So it's really cool to see a student bringing this into a different medium, and as well as obviously combining elements that she learned from Josef and Anni Albers.
Exactly. So I'll just focus in case there's any question, this area in particular, there's a real believable sense of an illusion of transparency going on. You see this line continue through, sort of, there's this repeated cross-like form that shows up all over the place, but it really appears that this rectangle is intersecting with the cross right here. And I would posit that it would be almost impossible for this to have been improvised in any way. As you say, it had to have been planned out thoroughly ahead of time.
Definitely would say so.
Another great topic that I cover in my book that is also featured towards the end of Albers's book are leaf studies. Leaf studies exist in this really interesting place within Albers's pedagogy. They are not just about color, they're about the leaves and about the shapes of leaves. They're about some version of graphic design and about how to lay out a picture plane in an interesting way that engages the shapes and the colors. And we have this great example that's in the collection of the Josef and Anni Albers Foundation, made by Asawa sometime between 1946 and 49, which were the years she was at Black Mountain College, made in Josef's color class using dogwood leaves that she has arranged on top of a sheet of bright blue paper. And at first look, or at first glance, they sort of appear to be just randomly laid about. But then on closer look, you see that she has arranged them so that the shadow of another leaf exists within the groups of leaves. And she does it again down here. She's giving us an illusion of transparency. There's this ghost of a leaf that's floating through there. She's given us an illusion of transparency in the quietest way by playing with the variation of hue and of value within each leaf, and doing that on top of this bright, bright blue that makes the entire graphic image really pop off the page.
Yeah. And this is such a great example of a leaf study. And leaf studies in many ways are so representative of Black Mountain College because they're created with the most simple material that you can find here in the mountains of Western North Carolina.
Right,
Fallen leaves, and
right.
anyone can access them, and they don't cost any money, which was really important, especially during the early years when Albers was teaching. So yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And they're frequently very colorful. It's hard to say. I mean, again, this is an almost 80-year-old leaf study, so hard to say exactly what those leaves looked like in the moment. Whatever the case, they have retained some of their magic until now, and that's great. As I say in the book, you don't need to have access to Western North Carolina leaves. There are leaves in many places, and even if one lives in a place where there aren't leaves, or it's winter and the leaves aren't doing anything interesting, this variety of bringing things other than traditional art classroom materials into your studio or into your practice allows all sorts of interesting things to happen. So, it could be sticks and stones, or it could be things from the recycling bin, or it's this invitation to bring alternative forms of color into these studies.
There is one more leaf study if you wanted to look at that together.
Yeah, so Hazel Larson Archer, the great photographer of Black Mountain College, made this study. And so in this, we see at least the image of two different tulip poplar leaves, these wonderful four-lobed shapes that show up in lots of Black Mountain era leaf studies that have been overlaid in a technique of photogram. Would you say that's accurate? It's a photogram?
Yes.
Yeah. It's in black and white. It's a black and white photogram. And so we're not getting the sort of bright colors and hues that might come into some other leaf studies. It's obviously a leaf study. There are leaves right there. And she's continuing those ideas from Albers's classroom, where the graphic form of the leaf is used to break up the picture plane and to create the image.
Yeah, and this is such a cool technique The photogram technique is where you're actually taking a material and you're laying it directly on top of the photosensitive material, and then you're exposing it. And so it's like a photograph that's made without a camera. And so I love this really direct engagement with the material, which is certainly something that was so present at Black Mountain.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of exercises that appear in the book that are actually in black and white, which is, funny when you think about interacting with color. We don't think about black and white composition as even having color in it, but it's all color.
Everything that we can see has color in it. Even if it's in black and white, there's value there. As I had talked about early on, it was the going through this material, one of the things we really gain is an articulation of color. We're able to talk more fluidly and more fluently about what we see when we look at color. And so these core ideas of what is a hue, what's a value, and what is saturation in color, and how we're able to use those come back over and over and over again. So as we're looking at these black and white images, there's value for sure in there. There's not much hue usually. Value being the lightness and darkness of a color. Hue, in the simplest terms, is just what is that color's name? Is it red, green, blue, purple, or whatever?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a study in black and white can be really valuable because sometimes when there's a lot of hues going on, it's actually hard to delineate value. And so exploring them all in a different sort of context and looking at all of these elements individually, just as you break it down for us in the book, is so, so helpful to building this understanding of color.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I hope it's useful to all of our watchers and listeners.
I hope so too. All right. Is there anything else that you wanted to kind of chat about? Feels like that was
I
really
think we've
good.
covered a great deal of territory here.
I feel like that too.
I suspect that we sort of, I think we hit some great topics, but we might have moved quickly, and some of the concepts are a bit hairy in there, or maybe not. Maybe they're perfectly clear. I hope they are. So my recommendation would be to get the book, of course, and spend some time with it.
Absolutely. So if you want to pick up your own copy of the book for our viewers, you can buy it online or in person at our museum bookstore already. It's in stock, but you can also find it through Yale or wherever you get your books.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much, Fritz. It was so wonderful to talk to you, and I can't wait to see what people end up doing and exploring with all of the activities in the book. It's such a great resource.